let's jump right in. And I'm going to ask you what this is. To me, it looks like a fecal sac. You know what a fecal sac is. Birds don't want their babies to poop in the nest, so they've evolved this little sac. The babies put their poops in a sac, and the parents fly out and drop it, and it goes splat. And if you don't want to be eaten, it's good to look like a fecal sac. And that's what this bola spider is doing. But at night, it looks like a real spider. And it hangs from a leaf, drags a single strand of silk, puts one sticky glob of glue at the end there, and it goes hunting. You wouldn't think it would catch anything, but it does. Moths fly in, get caught, they spin them around, wrap them up in silk, and then they have a good meal. And after they've had one meal, they go hunting again, catch another moth, have another meal. And after they've had enough meals, they have the energy to create an egg mass. It's in a silken patch, and if they hunting's really good, they make 2 or 3 egg masses. They hang there all winter long, and that's how they spend the winter. The real question is, why are moths flying into this one target? Well, it's not an accident. This is the female is actually releasing the sex pheromone of one particular species of moth. So all the moths that come in are males. They think she's a female. She is, but she's the wrong species. And I wanted to know what species of moth the bola spider in my yard was attracting. So I unwound the little bodies that were all underneath her, and it turned out to be the bronze cutworm. And I've got bronze cutworm males in my yard because I've got bronze cutworm caterpillars, and I've got bronze cutworm caterpillars because I've got goldenrod, which is their primary host plant. I also have this beautiful moth, the dot line white, because I've got oak trees, primarily white oaks, and because I don't rake the leaves away from underneath those trees. There is a dot line white cocoon in this leaf litter right there. You would never see it when you're raking leaves. And when we rake our leaves away, we're throwing a lot of interesting creatures away with them. I've got evening primrose moths because I planted evening primrose specifically to attract that beautiful moth. And it worked. The moth came, spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. Sometimes it's crowded, but it's always cute. I've got zebra swallowtails because I planted pawpaws. That is the only host plant of that beautiful swallowtail. It would take me a long time to describe all the species that now call our property home. It would not take me long to describe what's happening in a typical residential landscape like this. There is no goldenrod, so there's no bronze cutworm, so there's no bola spiders. There are no oak trees, so there's no dot line whites. There's no evening primrose, so there's no evening primrose moth, no pawpaws, no zebra swallowtails. There is very little that can live in a typical residential landscape, and we've got 135 million acres of typical residential landscapes in the U.S. That is 5 times larger than all of the land managed by the National Park Service. And we're not through. We're developing 800,000 new acres of natural areas every single year in the U.S. And that's one of the reasons we're seeing some scary headlines these days, like the insect apocalypse is here, talking about global insect decline. We've lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. 22% decline in our butterflies just since the year 2000, and they weren't doing that well in the year 2000. 2/3 of Earth's wildlife is gone. 40% of Earth's plants face extinction. The UN predicts we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction in the next 20 years. And they made that prediction 3 years ago. So now it's the next 17 years. It's a prediction, hasn't happened yet. And we got to make very sure it doesn't happen because those are the species that run the ecosystems that we all depend on. But there's enough bad news that Elizabeth Colbert gets to write the 6th extinction. It is talking about the 6th great extinction event the planet has ever been through. And this is the first one, though, that is caused by a living being. And you can guess who that is. Now, we do have parks and we do have preserves, particularly our national parks. They were established primarily because they were exquisitely beautiful places. And Teddy Roosevelt had a lot to do with that. He said the establishment of National Park Service is justified by considerations of good administration. So Teddy was patting himself on the back, as he should. Of the value of natural beauty as a national asset, and of the effectiveness of outdoor life and recreation in the production of good citizenship. In other words, our parks were created because they were pretty places for us to play in. They were not created with conservation in mind. And that's one of the reasons we only have 3.6% of the US in the national park system, and only 12% is federally protected, which lags behind a lot of other countries. But people ask, why our parks and preserves, why our land conservancies, why all these little places that we've concerned aren't good enough to sustain the biodiversity that we need? And it's a good question. And there are actually several answers, but the big one is they're typically too small. When you take a large area like this and you shrink it down to a little habitat fragment, and that's an exaggeration, You're taking large populations and shrinking them down to small or tiny populations. And that's the problem. Small populations are highly vulnerable to local extinction. Why? Because all populations fluctuate. In good times, they go up, and bad times, they go down. If you're a large population like this top line here, even in your down cycle, there's enough individuals so you can increase quickly when times get better. But if you're a tiny population, often in your down cycle, you hit zero. You blink out of your little habitat patch, and then you're gone. And unless you recolonize it, which is getting harder and harder, picture a box turtle crossing a major highway, it doesn't happen anymore. Then you're permanently gone. That's called local extinction. And there's studies all over the planet, some of them more than 100 years in length, telling us the same thing. We have not preserved enough of the natural world to preserve the biodiversity that we humans require. Now, we tend to use extinction as a metric of trouble, and I don't think that's a good idea because that's like going to the doctor when you're dead. We need to turn this around before things are extinct. So I think a better signal of a problem is defaunation. It's when the abundant species that are actually running our ecosystem start to decline. This is a great example. The American chestnut, it was the major tree from Maine all the way to Georgia along the Appalachian crest. We brought in the chestnut blake and essentially wiped it out. Now it's not extinct. There's still sprouts that come up here and there, but it's functionally extinct. It's no longer performing the roles it once did in our eastern deciduous forest. Same with the rusty patch bumblebee. Not long ago, it was one of the most common bees in the entire continent. Today, if you see one, it's a big deal, and I have never seen one. So again, not extinct, but functionally extinct. Same with the American beaver. When Europeans came to this country, the hydrology of the entire country was established by beavers and maintained by beavers, and we trapped them all out. Not every last one. There's a few around. And every time a beaver acts like a beaver, we trap it and move it someplace else. So the hydrology is still changed. So we're talking about defaunation. That's the reduction in the abundance of the species that actually run our ecosystems. That's the real problem. It's local. It's everywhere. And believe it or not, we tend not to notice it. And we don't notice it because of something called shifting baseline. We tend to think that the way things were when we were kids is the way they've always been, the way they ought to be, and the way they will be in the future. So if we're born into a world that has been defaunated, we don't notice it. That's normal to us. None of us missed the passenger pigeon. It was the most numerous bird on the planet, but it was extinct before any of us were born. So shifting baseline means that we're losing the biodiversity that sustains us, and we don't even notice it. Edwin Wade Teal decades ago said we cannot make the world uninhabitable for other forms of life and have it habitable for ourselves. It is the most basic common sense. So what are we going to do? Well, we could listen to E.O. Wilson. He says we need to save nature. We need to save functioning ecosystems on at least half of planet Earth, or it will disappear everywhere. He said that in this book, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life. And he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that bold statement. And then he ended the book. He didn't spend a lot of time telling us how we were going to save nature on half of planet Earth. Of course, to a conservation biologist, that's a great idea. We'll just put half the Earth aside and everything that's in trouble can be in that half. We'll be in the other half, and it'll be great. Problem is, half of terrestrial Earth is already in some form of agriculture. I don't see that disappearing anytime soon. And we got 8.2 billion people in the other half. And let me remind you that a billion is 1,000 million. There's a lot of us out there. And of course, we have all of our hardscape, our roads, our airports, our detritus, and we don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So how can we realize E.O. Wilson's dream? Well, I actually think we can, but we need a new approach to conservation to do it. We have to give up the idea that humans and nature cannot coexist. Not only is living with nature an option, it's now the only viable option that's left to us. Now, in the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head and practice conservation where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. So we're not just going to practice conservation here. We're going to practice it over here. But there's nothing to conserve over here. So we have to go beyond conservation into restoration. We have to put it back. And that means we've got to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not hang on by a thread, but thrive. Now, people talk about fragmentation of viable habitat as being the major problem, and it's certainly a big one. We've taken our viable habitats, reduced them to tiny little specks of what they used to be, and they're separated from each other, which means there's problems from inbreeding depression. So all the plants and animals in a habitat like this are closely related, and that causes problems over time. So the solution that's been proposed is to build biological corridors connecting these isolated habitat fragments so the plants and animals can move back and forth and you don't have to mate with your brother or your sister. Okay, that's great. But look, the major problem still remains. They are still small populations because the habitat is still small. So I think we've got to go beyond biological corridors and build viable habitat in between viable habitats. We've got to put the plants back. And this is better. This is even better. The light areas will be where our major cities are in our agriculture. But we're going to put the plants back where we live, where we work, where we play. In other words, on our private properties. And that means we need a new attitude about property rights. We've got this idea that we can own a piece of the earth and do whatever we want with it. This is our castle and we're the kings, and don't tell us what to do. But our yards are not like Las Vegas. I know many of you know that what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. What happens in our yards does not stay on our yard. That's the big difference. Our yards are all part of local ecosystems, and whatever we do on them, either positively or negatively, is going to impact that entire ecosystem. Let's talk about lawn. We've got a lot of it. 44 million acres of lawn is the latest statistic I've seen. That's an area bigger than New England dedicated to an ecological deadscape. Why do we do this? Well, a couple of reasons. First of all, it's a status symbol. It's a well-entrenched status symbol. We like neat. It's easy to keep lawns neat. And we have to display our Halloween decorations. But this is what happens when you decide to have a lot of lawn. You're determining whether rain is going to infiltrate or leave as stormwater runoff. And when it leaves a stormwater runoff, you're going to determine whether or not you're polluting your local watershed. You're going to, all the nitrogen and phosphorus and herbicides and insecticides that you add to your lawn is going to wash off into the watershed, polluting it. You're going to determine how much carbon you're adding to the atmosphere every single time you mow. Remember, mowing adds carbon, and we do that just about once a week. You're also going to determine how well you're supporting pollinators. If you have a lawn the way we're supposed to have a lawn, you're not supporting pollinators at all. You have totally removed pollinator habitat. You're also going to determine how much carbon you're sequestering, how much carbon you're pulling out of the atmosphere, locking up in plant tissues. Trees are good, but so are meadow plants. And then those plants actually pump carbon into the ground through their root systems. So in other words, you're determining how well you are helping climate change. And then your plant choice is going to determine whether you're harboring ecological tumors in the form of invasive plants. These plants from other continents, very poor at supporting food webs. They don't stay where we plant them. That's calorie repair you're looking at. And this is what calorie repair does. And we've got dozens of these ornamentals that have invaded our ecosystems, pushing out the native plants that do support them and replacing it with plants that don't. So our plant choices, the final thing our plant choice is going to do is determine whether or not you're supporting a viable food web. Are you choosing the plants that actually share some of the energy they capture from the sun with other creatures, typically as mediated by insects? So how we landscape, how much lawn we have, and our plant choices are going to determine how much life our properties can sustain. And that is an awesome responsibility. And unfortunately, it's an awesome responsibility that most people don't know they have. That's why we're doing this. We're trying to get that word out. It also creates a grassroots solution to the biodiversity property. Remember all those people out there. We have millions and millions and millions of them. Many of them are property owners. And if they realize they have a responsibility towards conservation, we can turn this around. I do talk about property owners because 78% of the lower 48 states is privately owned. 85.6% of the area east of the Mississippi is privately owned. If we don't practice conservation on private property, we're going to fail. And that makes property owners collectively the hope and the future of conservation. So there's something that's common to conservation approaches. it really becomes a people issue. Whether or not they succeed is going to depend on the decisions that you and I make. We need to change our adversarial relationship with nature to a collaborative one. I think it's the only way forward. And the question is, can we do that? Well, of course we can do that. It doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. There are more and more people that are worried about the state of the planet, but they feel powerless. What can one person do? Well, one person can shrink the lawn. One person can change their light bulbs, outdoor lights from white to yellow lights that don't attract nocturnal insects. One person can add a pollinator garden. One person can remove their invasive plants. One person can be sure to have keystone plants on their property, the ones that are actually supporting the food web the best. One person can fire your mosquito fogger. One person can hire Planet Wild. One person can do a whole bunch to improve the ecological function on their property and then enhance their local ecosystem instead of continuing to degrade it. And very importantly, it shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You get depressed. Worry about the piece of the earth that you can influence. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Robert Swan once said the greatest threat to our planet is believing that someone else will save it. It's not going to be someone else. It's going to be you. It's going to be you. I'll help a little bit, but it's going to be you. And whether or not you do so now is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own. Thank you very much.